Hello, welcome to the Open to Hope Show. I'm Dr. Heidi Horsley and I am your host. And we are partnering with the Compassionate Friends. And today my mom cannot join us, but I have a dear friend of mine who is going to co-host, and his name is Doneley Meris. Hi, Doneley.
Hi.
So Doneley and I met, I don't know, how many years ago was it?
22 years ago, maybe?
Did we meet that long ago? Oh my.
ADAC, there
yes,
we go.
Yes, we did. We met at the Association for Deaf Educators and Counselors.
That's right.
And Doneley was very involved there and involved in the diversity committee. You were the chair.
Yeah.
And you did something amazing. Remember what you did when you went in and brought all that artwork?
Well, I recruited a lot of members of the organization to actually bring their culture and how they mourn their communities. And people responded, and it was very good.
I love that. And that's going to be kind of segue to what we're talking about today.
Absolutely.
Because we're going to talk about art today and how to create legacy around art and how art brings people hope again. And we are going to focus on two incredible artists that died in the 90s. And Doneley is going to tell you about them because he is very familiar with their art and he's familiar with them. But before he does that, we also have three amazing guests that Doneley is going to introduce. I want to introduce Doneley quickly. He is the founder and executive director of the HIV Arts Network. He is an adjunct faculty at New York University and Hunter College here in New York City. And he is a psychotherapist and an HIV/AIDS mental health training consultant. So welcome, Doneley.
Thank you.
And again, thank you for co-hosting. So
Absolutely.
Why don't we start out by you introducing our guests today? And I know that you're very familiar with them and you've worked closely with them.
Absolutely.
Over the years.
Our first guest is Judy Glantzman. She is an internationally renowned artist, and she has had lots of fellowships where she created art specifically for museums, and she is an painting instructor at RISD, and also an instructor at the New York Art Studios. Our next guest is Sur Rodney Sur, AAA artist, activist, and archivist. He has been a long-time volunteer and board member with Visual AIDS, and over the course of many years, working with Gracie Mansion at the East Village, where most of the people that they represented lived with or maybe died from AIDS. And in the course of his work in the arts community, he would take breaks to take care of friends and loved ones who died from HIV/AIDS. And our last panelist is Hal Bromm. Hal is a pioneer in the art world. He created his gallery in Tribeca in 1975. He is a founding member and board member of HIV Arts Network, and also a historic preservationist. He was the past president of the Historic District Council here in New York City. Welcome, everybody.
Wow,
Thank you.
this is an impressive panel.
Yeah, indeed.
I mean, I've looked at their bios and I was like, wow. Yes, and I wanted you to really co-host this with me because you understand the art world.
Right.
And you understand the two people that we're going to be focusing in on today. Can you tell us a little bit about what we'll be talking about today, Doneley?
Well, absolutely. Hal is currently showing the artworks of Louise Frangella and David Wojnarowicz, two artists in the 80s who were both East Village artists and we're good friends. And the show right now is actually a lot of shows that are the work that they did during 1984 when they both went to Argentina. Luis is from Argentina, and he invited his friend David Wojnarowicz to go to Argentina, and during the time that they were there, they created art together. And that's the bulk of the art show at Hal Bromm Gallery.
So I'm going to hold this up. And what is this, Hal, that I'm holding up?
This is the gallery invitation to the exhibition.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah.
And
during this exhibition, we've had a series of panels, and Judy and Rodney have been on panels to talk about the lives of David and Louise. And so I think it's really great to be here today to talk about them with you, Heidi.
I love it. And your gallery is on 90 West Broadway?
In Tribeca, right.
Very good.
I'd like to ask Judy the first question, which is, you were very close friends to David in particular, but to Louise also. And you were at, for David in particular, you were there at the last moments of his life. Being friends with people who died from AIDS, how have you sustained that energy and your creative energy and continue to help and care for friends who have died from AIDS?
Well, I think David and Louise were remarkable artists, and they really both had a great deal of integrity. And that integrity is something that stays with you, and it's just as a kind of a model for what it is to be an artist. And I think that they had a great kind of cross-section of being different and similar to each other. David was an activist, and I think Louise was more of a kind of not that David wasn't a private person, but David's life became a part of his work, and Louise was more of a kind of a private person. And I was thinking about how, in some ways, even in terms of support, I think it was more difficult for Louise because he was more private of a person and didn't have as much support in a way. But I think about David and Louise all the time as a kind of inspiration. And then, you know, just in terms of also having experience with them, other artists that we, you know, when I was friends with them, they also had common friends that were also wonderful artists that died of AIDS. I'm happy that David and Louise, but particularly David, has made work that actually can continue to speak and give a lot of support to, I think, a lot of future, younger people. So
absolutely. Well, aside from Hal's show right now, David had a retrospective show at the Whitney this summer. There were a lot of other shows at PPOW that highlighted his work. And Louise also...
Fales Library.
The Fales Library at NYU. And also Louise has several shows internationally, not just in New York City, that is actually providing them a forum again for other people, today's generation, to see their art and to see that their legacy is out there, which is a great thing.
Continues to speak.
Absolutely.
That's pretty amazing.
That's a good observation. Particularly in David's case, and not only his visual art, but also his writing.
I think, in a way, because of his life and his art are sort of so inseparable, that he becomes a kind of a model, and it's easy to kind of identify with him in certain ways too, because it's so wedded together.
Well, I think a big thing that helped catapult David or bring him to the foreground was his writing. Because there were a lot more people that were exposed to David as a writer.
Exactly.
And if we think of if that voice wouldn't have been out there with the way that he was going at and talking about his experiences and his thinking with living in HIV and AIDS, I don't think the paintings would have surfaced in the same way. And that's really important. Louise didn't really have that. It was all through his art and through the community that he was around. And he was like, sort of like, as I've talked about before, he was sort of like a guru to a whole group of younger artists.
Right. And I think part of the story of those two artists is that they were friends and they mentored each other. Louise was older than David. When they went to Argentina, they created work together, and that enhanced the paintings of David in a lot of ways.
So now what I read, Doneley, for those out there that don't have any context, tell me if I'm correct. David was 14 and had been abused, and he ran away from home and ran to New York City.
Right.
And Louise was from Argentina and was well-schooled. He went to MIT,
yeah, exactly.
And he went to school in Argentina, and they met and became friends, and Louise became kind of a mentor to David?
And vice versa.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that is a very good background. The huge difference was that David came from, born and raised in New Jersey, but raised in quotations because his home life was very disturbed. His father was an alcoholic who would come home from work drunk and beat up the kids and his wife. And so David did run away from home just to get out. Louise, on the other hand, grew up in Buenos Aires in a well-to-do family, had a great education, came to the States, to Boston to go to MIT, and then they both ended up in the East Village, late 70s, early 80s, when that scene was starting to percolate. And Judy and Rodney were both very much a part of that scene.
Wow.
And then I came into it having met Louise and his partner, Russell Sharon, and David and any number of other great artists, I was very attracted to the energy and the vitality coming up through the East Village. And the art that was being made there was, for me, really, really exciting. And ultimately, I opened a second gallery on Avenue A in the East Village to focus on what was going on there. But the scene was, as much as it was bubbling up and growing, came to a quick end by the end of the 80s because of what had happened with the AIDS epidemic. And it had such a heavy impact on the artistic scene.
Well, and from what I read, now tell me if I'm wrong, but David was very edgy, and he was showing like the they were talking a lot of, they were doing a lot of things around the oppression and what was going on at that time. And one of the beautiful things about David was that he wasn't schooled. So he could go and just
Very
speak
much
his truth,
self-taught,
and he had a
yeah.
lot of anger, and he could just go and be real, and there was no, and like
No,
you said,
no filter.
no
Yeah.
filter. I like that.
No
Okay, thank
filter.
you.
Yeah.
I'm trying to come up with the words. Yes, no filter.
But I think what Louise brought to him was
Yeah.
a kind of a classical training that gave David even a kind of confidence.
Okay.
And so I think, just having somebody that you saw as having a classical training support, the kind of rawness in your work, I think it encouraged David a lot. In a way, David was learning to be a visual artist in the life of something as you're learning, you as the viewer could see as he was learning. So it's a kind of a vitality in that way too.
Well, and I love that you guys were all part of this, because when I was reading it, it was amazing and really neat to think that Louise would go at night after everything had closed, and he would go into his loft and cook things, and everybody would gather there.
Yeah, he was in some ways a kind of father figure to a lot of the younger artists.
Yeah.
I think he was almost 10 years older than David. And I think that but as Judy said earlier, they both gave to each other. David gave Louise a totally different perspective because of his background. And for David, it was a great thing to have someone who really knew how to paint, who knew how to handle a brush, and who knew how to do things just automatically. And I think David learned a lot from him artistically in that way. But the trip to Argentina, I think, was probably a great adventure for both of them. And while they were in Argentina, they curated a huge show of East Village artists, and Judy was in that show.
Wow.
Yeah,
That's
and that
amazing.
took
What an
place in
amazing time
Buenos
to be an
Aires in
artist.
1984.
And I know that there was a lot going on as far as, a lot of changes going on in the 70s, and a lot of protesting, and they were on the cutting edge. And I also read they would go to the Pier, and do like giant murals.
Pier 34, yeah.
And you were part of that too.
Yeah, tell me about that. What kind of things would they
The thing about, I think both David and Louise had a kind of view of what it was to be an artist. I mean,
Okay.
Louise would make dinners for people because he wanted that kind of sense of community. So the Piers was really David, and Mike Bidla was the other artist. And I think the intention was to keep it as open as possible, a kind of democracy, and not so much of so that people were invited to come and make work there. But the space itself was sort of this half decay. It had been I think it was one of the piers where the boats came in, so that when we got there, all the ledgers, it was almost like everything had been left, and then David planted little grass seeds there. So there was a kind of a rebirth and destruction. It was definitely a building that was really under decay, and then it was in terms of how art could bring something back to life. And the Piers had a lot of significance for David and Louise in other kind of ways. That there was a kind of a feeling of going in there and being able free to do what you wanted to do, and a kind of very, very special in that way.
And we also have to realize that it was a very different time in the history of New York, where New York was still basically poor, abandoned. There were burnt out buildings everywhere. There was a lot of space. You could get away with doing almost anything. 42nd Street was still a slimy, sleazy stealth.
and I think of
Neighborhoods were
Avenue
very
A.
different.
Avenue
it's,
A.
where you had your
A
gallery.
lot of drugs.
so there was this idea that anything was possible, and
Yeah.
you could go and make change,
Yeah.
create
And you
change,
could go
just
paint
go and
and
do
do
something.
things, and make
It's
murals.
Undisturbed.
Yeah, and
it
there
was like a
wasn't
canvas. Everything was a canvas,
right.
wasn't it?
And there
blank
wasn't
canvas?
anything that would rein it in. Things would just happen. Now
That's cool.
it's you can't quite do that anymore.
Things would
Everything's
just
more
happen. They would
privatized.
just-
Everything has to be done through some kind of business arrangement, contract, licensing sort of thing. You don't have that same kind of a freedom. And I think it's a freedom of having all that open space and being able to just do stuff that you don't have now that allowed a lot of that to
And being
kind
able
of
to all
develop.
collaborate.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of going down on the docks and everybody just kind of putting in their piece
Right.
together.
Yeah, word of
It's
mouth
amazing.
spread that
Yeah.
Mike and David had discovered this abandoned pier, that you could get into it, and there were huge walls, and they would just, Louise would go in and paint, 15, 16-foot high figures on these enormous walls, and there was nobody to stop them for a long time. And word got out among artists in the scene, and suddenly artists were coming in by the dozen, and every
Wow, that's
every wall
amazing.
had
That's
another
cool.
amazing work of
Yeah.
art.
Because, I was thinking, coming down here, thinking about David and Louise, and they each had their own particular vision, and that vision included everything they did in their lives. And here was this giant place where nobody put things on top of other people's things. It was a lot of space, but it was actually where each individual, there was a place for the individual in this other, the spirit of the place was shared by everybody, I think.
That's
That's
incredible.
that
I
is
think
incredible.
today there's a big sense of mourning among the artistic community, at least as we knew it and know it, for that kind of freedom, for that kind of magic to happen. I mean, the East Village magic was palpable and real, and the artists would have wonderful stage sets and curtains and things at clubs for the Limbo Lounge and the Mud Club and all these Club 57 and what were some of the, and the pier, I don't know where that exists
That's
today.
what I'm thinking.
There's a
As I
sense
sit
of
back and
mourning.
hear this, because I didn't grow up in this culture, this thing, which I love. So what I'm hearing is, okay, so you all came together, and it was almost like a chosen family, and you were all artistic and creative and expressive, and there weren't so many rules and laws and all these other things. I mean, New York City was a different place. But then how you said something, which I want to get to, where in the 80s, as the AIDS epidemic came and you all saw people dying and friends disappearing, you said things started to come to a screeching halt. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little more about that and what happened.
I always think that it's a combination of AIDS and Reagan coming at the same time, because I think even in terms of the other spirit, it's commerce that makes it different from that. In other words, commerce and art were not so entirely linked.
Yeah.
And so I think that it came to a screeching halt also because people who, when you talk about hope, whatever, there was a sense at a certain point, there was an infinite set of hope and future, and then there was a super finite sense of the future. That was very weird for people who were in their early 20s to feel like that they weren't going to be looking into the future of their lives. And I think that was a real shocking kind of, looking at that when you're a young person is a very complicated thing. I'm sure it's, basically somewhat, it's hard.
Looking at
to-
your own mortality. And
Yeah,
saying, you know what, I
immediately.
don't know how long I'm going to be here. I might not be here for that
Because
long.
you would see a person's demise. It was a pretty quick thing. Like
There was also a structure that I saw coming up in the art world to have people turn away from this whole community, and that was very much of a gay community driven by women and gay men, and the AIDS thing was a big part of it. And then there was a shift to something that came out, and I was actually on a panel where I actually watched them talk about this, and I was shocked that there was this movement that started in the art world called Neo Geo. And everyone started focusing on that, because then you didn't have to think about this other stuff.
What was Neo Geo?
It was called the New Geometry, and there were a
Okay.
group of artists that I remember someone saying in the panel were all a bunch of straight guys, and someone said, well, there are 4 of them, right? And they said, well, 3.5, because one of them was maybe doing a little bit of something else. But, so it took your mind off into this intellectual geometry kind of
Yeah.
structure. You didn't get into this feeling and all this other stuff that was
it wasn't
being
as
expressed.
emotive and
it was the
expressive.
opposite of a
It
motive.
was the opposite
Wow,
of that.
that's
So people could
interesting.
shut that down, and
Yeah.
then that market started taking off, and because of the market, everyone started going there, and this whole AIDS thing was shut down, and people didn't have to think about it as much anymore because they wanted to forget about it, particularly the people that had acted very badly. It was more of an occasion for them to forget about
So it
it.
kind of went from one extreme to the other.
Yeah, and then people believed that the art world kind of changed because this new movement came along. And I said no.
So Doneley, can you say more about that? You said to
Well, I think
silence
there's a
it.
silencing effect for that switch.
Yeah.
Because all those artists who were living with HIV, who were making art that was related to AIDS, were just slowly put aside. So the focus, the media focus on this new thing.
It wasn't so much related to AIDS, because I don't think the work was so much related to AIDS. David Wojnarowicz was an example. It was related to queerness, right? And this Neo Geo thing wasn't. It was like straight
Even
heterosexual
freedom.
guys.
It was oriented
Or
toward freedom.
freedom.
It's the opposite of that.
Right.
Yeah.
Shut that down.
The East Village scene, I think by the end of the 80s, there were different factors at work, but by the end of the 80s, it was over.
Well,
And
also economy.
It was very sad.
economy.
Well, there was the 87 stock market crash,
Right.
which had an impact.
But most of the galleries from the East Village moved to Soho, and now the galleries have moved everywhere ever since.
It's a real estate thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
It's
there
the way
were-
the real estate, and there were a lot of collectors that were involved in owning this real estate,
Yeah.
orchestrated the shift.
Yeah.
So, what you all were a part of in the 70s, do you see it anywhere else in New York? Has it moved out to Brooklyn? Has it gone to Queens? Or is it non-existent today?
I hear that it is existence. There
Okay.
are groups and pockets of it.
Okay.
But what they have to negotiate to be able to do stuff, it's not as freedom. They have to be either more clandestine about it or be more business savvy to be able to like acquire spaces and negotiate things or do it through residencies to get money. We didn't have to think about all that before. We could just
You weren't
find
worried
something
about being
and do it.
arrested if you tagged something or did artwork on something?
Yeah, I mean,
There was a sense that the city had gone, it was going bankrupt anyway, and there was a sense that it didn't really matter what you did.
Yeah.
So there was a
Pretty
sense
much-
of freedom to that.
I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, but the level of decay was also gave you a sort of sense of freedom. You know, it's like, I'm sure that in the world it exists because it always does, or maybe
Right.
bubbles up in different ways.
it'll always bubble
I
up.
don't
know
know
I
that it
suppose-
exists in New York, though.
I would say it's I would guarantee you it does not exist in New York, and in Bushwick, I think is where they sort of, you know, there's
That's what I'm
communities like that, and I think that's true. I feel like I think that at least for us, it was kind of a youth culture in a way. Like young people have a lot more energy for.
I mean, you
things
still
like
have
that.
Bullet Space in the Lower East Side. You have Le Petit Versailles in the Lower East Side. You have, you know, the St. Mark's poetry thing is still going on. The Judsons thing is still collecting some like subversive groups, and there's things like
Yeah.
World War III, the comics. So there are little pockets of them. But you know how information is disseminated. Everything seems to be targeted more through technology and media. So people kind of get it more through those and organize themselves more through those. Whereas before it was more person to person.
Right.
You'd have to sort of meet someone and talk to them. Now you can just do something through your virtual thing, and you could be in a space and no one could know who you are.
That's a really good
Right?
point.
Whereas
It's just
before
changed.
you'd have to talk to people so people
Yeah.
would know who you are.
Right.
Yeah, you'd have to physically be in community.
Yeah.
So how do you think Louise and David, how has their art, how does it still impact people today?
I think a lot of people take a great joy from looking at art like Louise Frangella or David Wojnarowicz, because in Louise's case, I think his art is a celebration of life. He did a lot of work with the figure. He used to make little terracotta models of hands and feet and heads and torsos, and then he would put them on a little pedestal and he would paint from those. They became the substitute for a live model. And so his paintings and his drawings are full of life. Their faces, their torsos, their figures, and they have a lot of animation in terms of life energy. David, I think people take tremendous inspiration from, because as Judy said, he was a great writer. And a lot of his works have not so much words. Some of them do have words. In fact, quite a few have words. But even when they don't have words, the way he uses imagery tells a story. And there's a story being told, whether it's about a junkie, whether it's about somebody who's gay, who's being stigmatized, whether it's about somebody who's being beat up or mugged. I mean, David tackled rough subjects, but the works have a narrative character, I think, that really tells stories, and I think people enjoy that a great deal.
Right. The other thing too is there's a lot of, in the academic world, there's a lot of students now who are gravitating towards their work. So there are students
For inspiration.
going into their PhD programs studying David's work, not only his writing, not only his paintings, but also his films.
Yeah.
In Argentina, there's students who are studying Louise's work and archiving his work, and that is a new generation of people trying to go back and seeing and reviewing the legacies of these two artists, which is amazing.
And what do you think is touching people to the point where they're going back and doing that?
2018, where we are right now, politically, culturally, creatively, all of their words and their work are right here, right now.
I think that something happened, though. There was this thing that we call the first and the second and the third silence. You know, in the late 1995, when the cocktails came out, even before that, there was this whole kind of activism started winding down because of the cocktails. And there's a whole generation of people that were born in the 90s and the 80s. And because of this wanting to push this AIDS thing and this lively stuff that was happening, and you moved into this other art world, was sort of de-queering for a while through the 90s, there's a whole generation of kids that didn't really know that this stuff was happening because it was sort of like talked about. We don't talk about it, it's AIDS, it's too bad, it's they're responsible, we don't want to think about it. And now they were born in the 90s, all this stuff was happening around them, but it was sort of kept from them. And now that they're older, they're finding out about it, and they're getting sort of angry, like, why didn't we know about this? Why didn't we know about all these great artists? Why didn't, and it was because there's been this gap. AIDS created a sort of like block or interruption from the transfer of information through the generations, because there's a stigma that shut it down, and all these kids, they didn't know what happened to Uncle so-and-so because the family didn't want to talk about it because it was too bad or too sad and they were too young. And now they're putting it together and saying, oh, do you mean all this stuff was happening? And now they understand it. And they even were carrying the stigma where they couldn't talk to anyone about it because they were told that you don't talk about this because it's too sad.
So on that note, Sur Rodney, I love that we're ending on that note because I think it's a powerful note. And I'm so glad that you've all given voice to what has gone on and to the legacy of Louise and David, and you know, the impact that their art is going to have for eternity, basically. So thank you for all that you have all done, because art does last forever. This was a great show. And thank you, Doneley, for being my co-host.
Thank you.
So this is Dr. Heidi Horsley at opentohope.com. If you've lost hope, please lean on ours until you find your own.